This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal, medical, or mental health advice. We speak from our personal experiences and opinions. The views expressed are solely those of the individual speaker and are not intended to malign any group, club, organization, or business.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Confronting the Line. I'm here today with my favorite resident expert, Ed Gurowitz. And when I say resident expert, I really do rely on Ed as my go-to person to help me sort out what's helpful, what's harmful in the world of transformational methodologies. And now I'm kind of deep into what the heck is that anyway? And so Ed very conveniently wrote a book to help me along. So today we're going to be delving a little bit into Ed's book and some of the questions that Ed and I have been discussing at great length. Yay, yes, there it is. So Ed, welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be back. Always a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we're having a lot of fun. Poor Ed, I was very skeptical when he reached out to me because, you know, he was like a trainer and a forum leader and deep in the inside of the est world, as it were. And so at first I was like, what is it? Why are you calling me? Do you know I just wrote a book questioning everything about that world? And in fact, Ed is actually the only really senior, I would say, level leader that has been willing to really explore publicly and speak to both the magic and miracles of transformational methodologies, as well as look honestly and openly at the harms that, quite frankly, many of which we can only see with the benefit of hindsight, you know, weren't necessarily evident in the time. The whole world of coaching, consulting, trainings has come a long ways since the EST was launched in 1971. And EST is sort of arguably one of the first really famous large group awareness trainings for sure, but that kind of public open enrollment offering of personal helps and self-development. And Ed was a big part of that in the 80s. So that's why I call my resident expert. So Ed, one of the things I wanted, we've talked a little bit about this, but one thing that, you know, your book is called Transformation from Potential to Practice, a handbook for personal and organizational change. One of the big things you and I have had a lot of discussion about is even just the word transformation. And one way that Landmark and many others sort of position that is as a technology, transformational technologies. So one of the things I wanted us to capture right off is we've had some really great conversations about what's the difference between a methodology and a technology. Because in some other episodes with some other experts, we've really seen the use of the word technology can be quite misleading. And it also has a little bit more to do with the culty world, actually making something mine and specific so that I can sell it. So anyway, I was just curious. I wanted to ask you, can you tell us a little bit about that? What's the difference between a technology and methodology? And
Sure. So first of all, a technology is a thing. It's a tool. It's a system. It's a device, usually developed through scientific or engineering knowledge to accomplish a specific task or solve a problem. So the focus of a technology is that it's the thing you use to get something done, and it's concrete, it's tangible, and it's either a tool or a system, as I said. Methodology is an approach. A methodology is a set of principles, methods, rules used to organize and guide a process, especially in research, problem solving, or implementation. So you hear problem solving, implementation. There's a little overlap there, but not really, because the focus of a methodology is how something gets done, not what gets done. So that in that regard, what I explore in my book and what we were doing at Landmark was a methodology. I think it was overstating it and overselling it, especially in the 70s when technology was just emerging. You know, when I went to college in the 60s, there was one computer on campus. And if you wanted to use it, you had to make an appointment and then bring a big box of punch cards and pray that you didn't slip on the ice and send the punch cards flying, because then you were sunk. And people did, by the way, do that. So to use the term technology in that era was, I believe, a bit of hyperbole, a bit of oversell.
Gotcha. Well, and it came as I don't know that this is where Werner pulled it from or Landmark pulled it from, but we can't deny the correlation, which is Scientology. So Scientology refers to their work as the tech. Nexium, several others have. So that was kind of how I ran into it. The first time I ever thought, I was like, well, wait a minute, what do we really mean by that? But I'm curious because you did define technology as tools, which I know is a big part of how I would say we relate to much of what you offer in your book, is that these are sort of they're tools that you can bring. Sorry, even like the distinctions at Landmark, I think that's how they would think of them, as those are tools. Integrity is a tool. Responsibility.
No, I have to disagree with you, because we would go out of our way to disparage tools. If you're here for tools and a quick fix, you're in the wrong place. What we were clear on, without using the terms, knew it was a methodology. It didn't start to get called a technology until the early 80s, when transformational technologies was the franchise management consulting arm of that world. Later came to be a licensing system called Technico, but that's a whole other story. So I think it was really another case, and there's so many of these where we were talking out of both sides of our mouth. We called it a technology. We said it, and we disparaged tools. And to say integrity is a tool, for me, is massively undervaluing integrity. Integrity as a methodology is a set of principles, methods, and rules. Now you got something. But as a tool, one of the things, there was a very famous document that came out of a training school in India called Maliwada. And it was on integrity. In fact, the title of it was on integrity. And it described 3 levels of integrity. The tool level is washing your hands, brushing your teeth. Then there was the second level, which is to be true to your ideals. That starts to move it out of the tool level. And the third level was to be true to yourself. And that gets us into transformation, because transformation at its root is the invention of the self, rather than the resignation to the self as designed, as the human
like kind
condition.
of automatic design, right? Like an ego structure. So really great. Well, and I want to confess that I'm probably, now I've talked with so many people about so much and been studying so much, it is all starting to blur together what was Landmark versus what we're talking about now. But, the purpose of confronting the line is to come to the line and examine what's helpful, what's harmful. And it's just been really great to have you to play with in that, because the hardest thing for me, when I started to find out about all the, abuse, and started to recognize the exploitive nature of the business that is Landmark and all that, it was really heartbreaking. And it was heartbreaking for a lot of reasons, but one of them was I didn't want to lose transformation as a methodology. I didn't want to with or have to give up, 26 years, like most of my adult life at this point, of engagement and study with a body of ideas that I found very valuable. And a lot of the difficulty has been reconciling that it was unimaginable to me that those ideas could actually cause harm. So the last year since my book came out has been a lot about confronting that. And you've been a really great resource in that, because you've really brought back into the conversation, like, no. First of all, it got twisted. Some twists and turns happen here that aren't true to the original ideas, not even just the original ideas of the est days, but the original ideas in which the body of work that was est came from, because it didn't just spring out of the ground. It didn't just spring out of Werner, not by even the slightest stretch, which is the other thing I really, really, really have appreciated about your book, because you really take a number of the ideas that I'm familiar with from the Landmark world and trace them to their more original sources.
Yeah, and that's important. If you talk to people about est, they'll say, well, it came out of mind dynamics. Yeah, that's what we call proximal cause. The root cause Goes back thousands of years. This is what Aldous Huxley called the perennial philosophy. And it's been around as long as people have been thinking. As to your other point, and I've always appreciated your work in trying to distinguish safe ways of approaching personal development from unsafe ways, but the ways themselves are not safe or unsafe.
Right.
How they're used, and if you go camping and you need to make a fire, an axe is a very useful tool to have.
That's
If
right.
you're Lizzie Borden, if that reference isn't too dated, an axe is a whole different story. Look it up. Look it up. Look it up. A hammer is great for driving nails. It's less great if you hit somebody in the head with it. So even if we took the definition of technology as a tool, it's still how the tool gets used, by whom, and with what intent.
And that's where it's so great that you're saying that, because yes, it is the tool, and how it gets used. I have to make the reference to a screwdriver, right? Like you can do some amazing things with the screwdriver, or you can murder somebody with a screwdriver. I mean, it can be used in a bad way. I, for one, was somebody who couldn't imagine the things that I had been exposed to teaching, learning as transformational, really used in a bad way. Or if it was, it would be it was hard to imagine, right? So how could responsibility have negative consequences? How could that idea applied or taken on by a person have negative consequences? Well, I've come up close and very personal with that one in particular, as now I've started to take apart some of these ideas. And you said something that rocked my world a week ago in one of our classes. So for folks that don't know, Ed and I have been doing a book discussion on his very book. We'll make sure a link to part 2 of it, which is about organizational transformation, is in the show notes, because we'd love to have folks come join us. But we were talking about responsibility, for example, and you said this thing out of the blue. You said where they screwed up. I won't use the real word you used because I might not remember to put explicit on here, but where they screwed up responsibility was when they tied it to cause in the matter. Because one of the things they've been grappling with is I talk to many, many, many people who feel that they have been harmed through their participation in not just landmark groups like it, Context, Insight, there's many other, Nexium, like they all have very similar things. Responsibility happens to be one of the tools that get used. It has different variations and definitions, but that happens to be one that a lot of people have experienced a lot of harm around. Well,
they did 2 things. They tied it to cause. Remember I said there were a lot of places where there were internal contradictions. So on the one hand, responsibility is your cause in the matter. On the other hand, in the training, and I think in the forum, we did a whole unit, a whole piece about false cause, that cause is completely a function of the frame. So if I push you and you fall down, well, I'm the cause of you falling down. But if somebody pushes me and I bump into you and you fall down, then the person who pushed me is the cause. And you can keep running that back infinitely. And that was what we called false cause. So that's number one. The other contradiction
from 1995 on. I can promise you from 1995 on, which is when I participated, none of that was in the training, because I've never even heard that before. And that's brilliant.
And the second place was the Werner's original published definition of responsibility that we used in seminars, we used it in the training, we used it everywhere, was responsibility starts with the willingness to consider that your cause in the matter. That was one. But then responsibility does not include blame, shame, credit, or guilt. Now, when you say to somebody, as a trainer once said to me when I was sick, why did you make yourself sick? That's blame, that's guilt. So again, it's, the same thing happens, to be fair, the same thing happens in institutional religion.
Absolutely, yes.
If you look at Jesus' teaching versus what people who brand themselves Christian, many people, not all, do with it today, they're unrelated, except by the label.
It's almost unrecognizable, and as somebody who grew up.
And so the use of responsibility in the training is almost unrecognizable if you look at the rest of the methodology and what the definitions were. And by the way, nobody ever defined cause.
Well, and so what I love the way when you said the other day is like, no, is tying it to cause, because responsibility, the real depth is about what you have the ability to respond to. I mean, that's a responsibility. And the
Fritz
weaponization
Perls said it's the ability to respond.
the ability to respond. So what I have responsibility for is what I have the ability to respond to. Yes. So, and how I respond, I have control over that. And also it's an enormous power. Where it gets abused, and I think sometimes very unwittingly, like without realizing it. I certainly didn't realize it until I started having a lot of people call and tell me long-term impacts of a misunderstanding of responsibility. The primary misunderstanding it kind of got conflated with the secret methodology of intention, that somehow, and I used to say this when I led, if you pull up to the light and it turns green, take the credit. You were causing the matter of a green light. I used to say that, like, own the magic. Now I know. It's so sad. Anyway.
I'm sorry, I'm just embarrassed for you.
I know, me too. Thank you. So it got conflated. Now, okay, so the green light, yes, the parking spot, I do still claim I do have parking karma, just for the record. Okay, those are innocuous. Those are benign. But I've heard it used so much now in abusive relationships. I'm in a
It's
relationship.
not. Here's where it crosses the line. To refer back to the line.
Yeah.
The parking spot thing is benign until you're late and you say, I couldn't find a parking space, and the other person says, why didn't you create one?
Right.
Then it stops being benign. By the way, you're in responsibility. You're back with Marcus Aurelius. You're back with the Stoic philosophers in, a couple of thousand years ago, who said you don't have any say in what happens to you. You have total say in how you, guess what, respond to it.
Right.
That's responsibility. You can respond to it by being a victim. You can respond to it by acknowledging it and learning from it. You can respond to it in a whole variety of ways. That's responsibility.
And it's right there in the world, responsibility.
Exactly.
But when it gets twisted, and look, this happens in virtually every group that we've looked at where there, it goes a little bit culty, and which is you have to redefine a word so that you can sell it as your own, you can trademark it, you can this, you can that, it, whatever, but you sell it. And that's what happens with so many of these leaders, whether it's James Arthur Ray or Werner Erhard or L. Ron Hubbard or Tony Robbins, or, we could just go down the list, and they're not all damaging. They all have good works and works that can be used in harmful ways. So, but what gets in a culty is where they have to make it something unique, something never before, never bigger than, better than, belongs to them. And that's what I love on the back of your book. It says this really great thing. Transformation is as old as humanity and has too often been seen as the province of elite priesthoods and arcane methods, holding out the promise of autonomy and fulfillment, but rarely achieving their promises. Like, that sentence nails the whole world of human potential, personal development, sales-ish to me. And like you rightly pointed out, it started a lot with the religions, right? Only the priests had the knowledge, only the so-and-so, then, it belongs to them. So therefore they now become the distribution source that you have to pay homage to in some way or another. And that's what I love about your book. It's starting to move the way the world is moving, which is tearing down those barriers, right? So
yeah, and that was my intention in writing it, was in part was to demystify transformation. It's not mystical. It's not arcane unless you choose to keep it secret. It is two things. It's
take all the credit for it.
Yeah, it's apprehendable. It can be learned, 200 pages, and it can be learned. And it's a practice. It's not an event. People talk about transformation as if it were an event. Transformation as an event is what we call a peak experience, or in Zen it's called Satori. But it's understood in Zen that Satori is fleeting. It's a probably necessary, certainly integral part of the Enlightenment practice, which is a lifelong practice. And it by itself, you have a Satori, and that's nice. Things look a little different, maybe, for a while. But if you're not practicing, my very first experience of that, I was reading a book called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Shunryu Suzuki. And he uses a metaphor in there talking about, I can't even remember what he was talking about, but he talked about a river flowing, comes to a waterfall, and drops of water fly out into the air as the water comes down the waterfall. And then at the bottom, they rejoin the river. Now, that for me, right place, right time, whatever, was an enormously enlightening idea. I've been practicing that idea in how I hold things like individuality and how I hold relationship and how I hold death and dying for 60 years, 50, 60 years since I read that. Had I not really thought about it and put it into practice and talked with teachers about it, it would have been a nice idea. That's interesting.
So do you think, okay, so that just brought something up for me. Do you think maybe, and I know, you and I had a great conversation with Dr. John Hunter, and I'm really appreciating his work in understanding large group awareness training. Again, is different than the idea. It's how the idea is being presented. So a lot of people don't really understand what large group awareness training is. Maybe I'll do a separate show about that. I'm not going to go too far into it here. But let's suffice to say is that it is a training experience where the emphasis is on the experience, and it tends to be very, very intense. It does happen in a group, although that's not the core. A lot of people think any large group training is now a large group awareness training. That's not true. There's lots of group trainings that are fantastic that do not fit the LGAT thing. Its emphasis is on this peak experience, on this, Sunday night at the Landmark Forum is like, you are as a kite on life, like no kidding. And it is using the group dynamic, much like in a concert, right? If you put a whole bunch of human beings together, that energy does come together and create this very big excitement. Dr. John has really hypothesized that it is a kind of hypomanic state that people get into. And it is this peak experience. And I'm very struck by a lot of people in the comments on this show and other things. They come back and share particularly about the S training, way more about the S training than the forum, that they still 50 years later, 40 years, that is an experience over which they'll never get. Like that is how strong that experience is. But I'm just curious almost if that high of an experience kind of mucked up the possibility of transformation in some ways, in that people then think that experience is it rather than the practice coming out. You see what I'm pointing at? Like that's just
I see exactly what you're pointing at, and I think you're right. But I also think, and if you're going to give credit where credit's due, you got to give blame where blame's due. Because when that got translated into, how you feel now, you can keep that feeling if you bring guests, or if you share the training.
Or
that
you
was
register.
How we put it. You share the training, and that'll keep it going. Well, that is not. That's a very small part of the practice of transformation. Yes, it helps. We are herd animals. We're social animals. So something as simple as if I'm going to quit smoking and don't tell anybody, I'm not likely to quit smoking for very long. If I tell enough people, I create for myself social pressure.
Yeah.
So there's a validity to, yes, go out and share it. I do believe that even Jesus said that part.
Yeah, but he's talking about sharing your breakthrough, sharing
your experience.
Sharing the product itself.
Exactly. And when you translate that into bring guests, invite people who we're then going to do a sales presentation, and it was absolutely a sales presentation. Then you have put a roadblock in the way of the practice of transformation. If you think all you have to do is share it, not live it, live integrity, live responsibility, live being complete, communication, all those principles in the methodology, then you're selling people a bill of goods.
Well, I think the more important part to live is to live the insights that you have in the experience. So to just use myself as an example, and this is where I've grappled a little bit, because the insight that I had was like, I didn't have to be limited by the the societal, predictable conditions of having given birth to my son at 15 years old and, being a teen mom, that I wasn't confined to what that looked like. Now, I kind of knew that going into the forum, but I was mostly fueling my success through raw ambition and a healthy dose of screw you, I'll show you, you're all wrong.
Which
Which
is
is,
how you survived when you having your son at age 15 and being a single mom and all that. So you had, and probably I would be willing to bet, and I go into this in the book, not about you, but in general, I would be willing to bet that that pattern of put your head down with sheer determination and push through was there long before you were a teen mom.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
probably.
So that's the point of transformation, is to realize that you are not your survival strategy, that the survival strategy served its purpose. You survived. Now, there's a problem with that because the single most addictive drug human beings have is survival. We become addicted to survival. And
Yes.
that's self-defeating. As I had to prove I was smart. Well, the only way you can, as a strategy, not as an end goal. Well, the only way you can prove you're smart is to keep on failing and then come back from it. So I did for years and years and years. So, and again, the point is this, and this is really why I wrote the book. For both individuals and organizations, we're given a script. Eric Berne called it a life script. We develop that. I'd say we're given it because we don't have the tools to fully develop it. We simply adopt it. There's a great quote from Kurt Vonnegut that's in the book about, I was a blob of nothingness and voices came pouring in. To discover, to appreciate that got me where we are. And it had its limitations. In my case, I had to keep on failing. I could not figure for many, many years how I kept snatching defeat from the jaws of victory.
Well, it's quite interesting because you're actually talking about that's very similar for folks that haven't listened to it. Go back and listen to my episode, the second one in particular with both of them are great, but with Dr. Glenn Doyle, as he speaks about trauma. So he's a trauma specialist, recovery, drug and addiction specialist, but particularly is a great voice of mine, one of the, top voices that we could listen to as it relates to complex trauma. And I asked him, we were just talking about the whole world of complex trauma, which, as listeners will know, I have a deep interest in because my daughter suffers from complex trauma. And he said the problem with trauma, because I'm like, well, what's the problem? Really?
As an old family therapist, I would invite you to say, my family suffers from complex trauma, because it's not just your daughter. Her complex trauma affects everyone in the family.
That's right. That's true. That's very true. Wow, that's really great. Thank you for that. What Glenn described, I found really interesting, was he said, we develop essentially strategies, coping mechanisms to survive whatever the situation is. So in my daughter's case, which she's given me permission to talk about this, but she had several years of sexual molestation. And then, quite honestly, straight out of Cinderella, which is very funny because her and I both love the Cinderella movies, but straight out of Cinderella kind of stepmother situation where she was being put down and whatnot in really harsh and scary ways for many years. And until we found out that all that was going on, and then we got her out of there. But by then she's 11. So from like 6 to 11, she's in these tough situations, as are many, many children, many, many people. But we develop coping mechanisms. And then the problem is, as we go along in life, those coping mechanisms, which when there's trauma involved, the way he talked about it, gets almost instantly and very strongly hardwired in a way that is really strong. And I had some of that. I had it 5 years old. We escaped. My mom and I escaped a bad guy who had raped my mother, and we escaped down an alley. And my whole identity, my whole idea that I had to save people or they would die, definitely got formulated as a 5-year-old running down the alley, knocking on doors to help get my mother to safety. And we did do that, and she lived. And then that was my job for the rest of my life. So
exactly.
we can see
And just for
Yeah.
the benefit of those watching and listening to this, those are the stories you hear about.
Yeah.
The fact is, and I always tell this story about when I was doing family therapy, about a family that came in, and just as you said, my daughter has complex trauma. Well, our son is all messed up. It's called the identified patient. And so I sat down and interviewed the son, and he said, they don't care about me. I said, how do you know? He says, well, they don't let me do anything. They won't even let me take out the garbage. Then I brought in the parents, and they said, he doesn't appreciate anything we do. I said, how do you know? He says, well, we do everything for him. We don't even make him take out the garbage. So, something as compared to what you grow up with, benign as something as benign as the kid doesn't take out the garbage, becomes as much the basis for what I call a survival strategy. Byrne called it a life script. Glenn calls it a coping strategy. Doesn't matter. Whatever Tracy Goss called it, the winning strategy.
Werner calls it a winning formula.
Yes.
Or something.
Not anymore.
Just say landmark. We shouldn't give it all to Werner because landmark has.
Well, in that case, it actually was, but that's a different story. The point is, nobody gets out of this without a survival strategy, which, unless they transform their relationship to it, where they stop being the victim of it and now it becomes something they have rather than who they are, something they do rather than who they are. Unless that happens, they're going to be the victim of that strategy the rest of their life. Transformation is exactly that shift. Now, with organizations, there's an absolutely comparable thing. Why, up until the mid-1950s, it began to break down, but up until 1950, 4,000 years, organizations, societies, villages, tribes, businesses were structured in hierarchies of command and control. That's the default design of organizations. Why? Because when the Romans, in about 200 BC, the Romans had this huge army. They were going to invade, they were going to create an empire. They're going to invade Gaul. They're going to invade Germany. They're going to invade Spain and England. What all those countries are now. Well, you can't just send people off willy-nilly, and you can't give orders en masse to thousands of men and expect they're going to follow them. No, you create a hierarchy. You create every 10 men is under the command of a decurion. Every 100 men is under the command of a centurion. Every 1,000 men, and on up until you get to the emperor. That's the default design of organizations, just like the thing we've been talking about is the default to create a coping strategy before you have the means, the intellectual wherewithal to do it. And, logically, intelligently, the way we would look at it now, like, why would you do that? Well, because everybody does the best with what they have. So on an individual level, you have this survival strategy. On an organizational level, you have this default paradigm for organizations, which is hierarchy and command and control. Now, there's added a lot of ramifications to that. How information, the least informed person in a command and control organization is the person at the top. Because everybody, from the shop floor on up to the C-suite, everybody is hoarding information because information is power, it's currency. So, in an organization, we call it personality. In an organization, we call it culture. Culture is just simply how work gets done. And culture can be by default. Work gets done through hierarchies of command and control, through withholding information, through politics, through all the stuff that makes organizations hellish places to work. Or we can design a new culture that has different principles.
The way I'm starting to see why I'm resonating with you. So am I hearing you correctly? Because the way you're talking about this sounds a bit like transformation as the way that you're related to it and teaching it and making it available to the world could actually be the only word that's coming to mind is undermine. I'm not sure if that's right, but kind of be water on the clay feet of the hierarchical systems that we have been stuck in. Basically, you nailed it, since the Roman times. It hasn't always been that way. I don't have my history stuff on me, but there are times where there have been societies that are not organized around that. But you got to go way back.
I don't
And you
think
got
you'll
to
find them. I don't
no,
think
no,
you'll
watch.
find them. I think they're just what you're seeing is societies that were more fragmented. But if you look at each fragment, that was the design of it: command and control.
Yeah,
It
I don't know.
might have
I'm
been
not. I
matriarchal. It might have been
call on my
patriarchal.
goddess guy, lead goddess guy, who's studied ancient civilizations much more than me to get into that. But
Okay.
I'm more interested. I want to bring folks back because the way you just talked about transformation and the way you teach it and the way you write about it in your book, um, in both personal and organizational, kind of erodes that hierarchical locked in model. And I would say, I think in the Being a Leader course, without having distinguished that is something that was definitely possible, is that leadership is not a matter of position. It's not a title. It's not a granting. And, this is why, for those of you that don't know, in Ed's history, so when Ed left the EST organization, and went out and started, consulting and coaching and working in organizations for what would be from 1991 until currently, and still is, worked very much in the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion, allyship, collaboration, all these things. And now I'm starting to see why you feel and transformation are so in lockstep, because a lot of the way I
It's all the
have
same.
been on the
It's all
dark
the same.
side of what's happened with transformation, where it got culty,
Right.
is where it got pulled into that hierarchical knowledge. I'm better than you. A dear friend of ours that we have in common is always talking about the clicky, yucky structure in those organizations. And he's absolutely right. He knows who he is. He's listening now. He can send us a private note. But he's absolutely right, because human beings will lord over each other with whatever they have. And if that happens to be knowledge, then fine. I have some secret.
Have you read Lord of the Flies?
No, I've
See,
seen the
it's
movie.
interesting. That book was very popular a long time ago.
Yeah. This is what I missed by dropping out.
So yeah, right. It's a story about a bunch of kids that get marooned on an island
Yeah, I'm familiar.
and organize themselves almost immediately into a hierarchy and persecute bully other people, and the whole thing. Here's the thing: the world. It took centuries to go from the Iron Age to the Bronze Age. It took centuries to go from the agricultural economy to a manufacturing economy. In the last decades, not many decades at that, we've gone through the experience economy, the attention economy, the knowledge economy, the information economy, and I believe now we are moving into the relationship economy.
Really? It
Yeah,
feels like
I have a client it's a large bank, not in the
Mhm.
United States. And I started working with them 2 years ago on transforming their culture to one of relationship, because they realized they could see coming that banking, which has always been very transactional, you go in the bank, you write a check, give it to the teller, they say thank you, you leave. Nobody does that anymore. When was the last time you wrote a check, much less
That was a bad example. Run to the pool guy about an hour ago, but
okay, well, bad example.
Pretty rare.
But mostly now, if you go to the bank, especially for businesses, there's got to be a relationship with the bank. I know the banker who handles my business at Wells Fargo Bank.
I actually know who is our personal banker at Chase Bank as well.
There you go. So this bank saw that. I was talking to somebody from a U.S. bank today who was looking for the same thing. And, when we talked about it that way, that the shift from transactional to relational in marketing and sales, doing business, she was like, whoa, yeah, that's exactly right. That's what we're up against in this
Well,
bank.
you're talking about what my dear friend Suzanne and I and Mark Goodman were trying to talk about a couple of years ago, which is, we were calling it collaboration or together better solve, is no, we could see that what's coming by hook or by crook, because so many people, one, are getting so sick from the loneliness. We have an epidemic of loneliness. There's just so many signs that the undermine and the erosion of our natural state as an interdependent species, like our understanding of ourselves as interconnected and interdependent. And that comes with a whole other set of responsibilities that we have been working hard to undermine and shed and trash. But
What's
it's not
interesting
working.
about that, Ann, is that it's not a new idea. Primitive
No.
tribes knew that. And at the same time, because of the workings of the brain, chapter 2, it became we're dependent on each other and collaborative and tribal,
Yeah.
except those guys aren't. We got to defend ourselves against them, who are also that way internally. But it came up against factionalism, except, there's probably more than one exception, but a notable exception is in South Africa, where the culture called Ubuntu, and Ubuntu translates basically as nobody wins if we don't all win, or we're all in this together. That was the exception to that until white people got there.
Interestingly, a lot of indigenous tribes, well, they did have warring and, all kinds of stuff in indigenous tribes, but
They were
mostly,
territorial.
yeah, many indigenous tribes have a very different orientation. In fact, I think I'll put it in the show notes, one of my all-time favorite videos. It's called Enoughness. And it's a 4-minute video that just explains very, very simply the very different background ways of thinking between a Euro-Western perspective on the world and the planet and society and an indigenous perspective. And I'm one since I was 14 years old, and I was an avid reader, and I read this fantastic, it was a historical romance novel thing, which I used to devour. And in it was a whole, I still have this book, actually. It's like practically falling apart. It's a paperback book. There was a whole thing about a white woman who'd been taken into an indigenous tribe, and then she falls in love and da-da-da. But one of the things that it posits in this historical romance fiction is that someday the white folks would need the indigenous folks to save the planet, because we would need to learn what at that time was being rejected. That imprinted on me in a very, very, very deep way. And I have been in pursuit
You have to tell us the name of the book now.
I'm going to have to go find it. I don't even remember. Hopefully I
Put it in the
didn't
show
pack it.
notes.
I
Put it in
haven't
the
read
show
I
notes.
I haven't looked at it in probably 20 years. But isn't it funny how those things make this little impression? And when I started doing the work on collaboration to really understand true collaboration, which I also got fascinated with when my husband and I, with our partners, had a hotel. We're managing a hotel in downtown Dallas during the Katrina evacuation, and it became dubbed Hotel Katrina. And we took care of hundreds of evacuees, and we organized 5.5 weeks. We essentially organized a whole relief and relocation effort and took care of hundreds of families. And it was one of the most impactful experiences of my life, for a lot of reasons, but mostly because I saw absolute miracles happen when a whole community came together to take care of itself. And it was something over which I will never get. Kind of like circling back to those peak experiences, except it was a peak experience that went on for weeks. And then I've spent years trying to understand what happened there that was different than what happens in everyday life, where we see so many people, attacking each other and coming after each other. I'm having a hard time in the current climate. I'm like on a self-proclaimed social media blackout right now.
Me too.
I just can't see right now. I need to take it in slow because of this. It's so antithetical to who I think we actually are. So that's really, it's really great. So you've kind of actually touched on one.
But wait, see, there is no who we actually are. Who we actually are is a blank slate. Who we actually are either gets created for us and we call it who we actually are, or we create it. And that's true individuals, it's true of organizations. So you take an organization like Zappos that's literally created their culture with a lot of trial and error and a lot of mistakes, but they're very successful, and it's one of the great places to work, from what I understand. I don't work there. Because they decided that they were going to be who they said they were, not who tradition, call it what you want, tradition, the human condition, the default design of organizations gave them to be.
They actually follow, you're talking about Zappos, right? It follows, and I've got this book. It's really great if you haven't read it, Holacracy.
Oh,
Which is
I practiced holacracy. The
Holacracy
Mankind
is-
Project, when I was national chair of Mankind Project USA, adopted holacracy as their governing principle. And
okay. More and more is getting revealed to me why you're such a cool old white guy. I always tease Ed. He's the most woke old white guy I've ever met.
Well, and you know, I don't know if he really said it, because there's a lot of quotes floating around from Pope Leo, but he supposedly said, being woke in a society that's asleep is not a crime, it's the gospel.
Well, gotcha.
He probably didn't say it, but
dangerous right now. But
yeah.
that feels like
But
it
here's the thing. This is the essence of transformation. It's realizing that that you're not constrained by who you invented yourself to be when you were 4 years old, and an organization is not constrained by who the Roman army invented it to be, 2,000 years ago. So I'm looking forward to the second round of the master class about my book, because we're going to deal with organizational transformation, and it's got a lot of similarity at the root. The methodology is the same, but in practice, it's much more difficult.
Gotcha. It's interesting. I have to say, after having done most of my career, I've worked in what I would say is personal transformation or individual transformation, and have really come to see, not even just in the run up to my book, where I start to question, I'm actually not questioning transformation at all in my book. I'm questioning a business, an organization. Yeah. I didn't have any questions about the work itself until my book came out and all these people started calling me, sharing their stories of ways in which they were harmed, which then sent me on a whole other
transformation.
In the name of transformation, exactly, which is really confusing, when something that we think is here to help us, to enhance us, is actually used to subjugate us or to harm us in some emotional.
So sort of like, compare the Sermon on the Mount with the Spanish Inquisition or the Crusades.
Yeah.
Okay, or compare the ethics. There's a core text of Judaism called Ethics of the Fathers. Compare that to Benjamin Netanyahu's government. Look, here's the thing. There are two principles. Lord Acton said power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So since power is in the West particularly, but also in the East, is part of the fabric of society, you're going to have corruption. Okay, that's number one. Number two, experience, profound experience, religious experience, spiritual experience, peak experience degenerates into dogma.
Yeah.
Very, very easily. I wrote a book about this with an Episcopal priest. We've never published, but that was the whole thesis of the book.
We should talk about that. That'd be great. Well, because that's exactly.
If you read it, watch a fella on Facebook, he's on YouTube also, called Dan McClellan. His motto, and he often wears a T-shirt that says, "Data is more than dogma."
So what I'm curious about, where I started to go with that is, and then I've also done some work in organizations with the same kind of transformational methodologies. And what I noticed right away is it was hell a lot safer and more ethically done in organizations. And I was like struck by that because it was in the middle of the fall of my book. But here's what I want to just know what you think about this theory, is because in organizations, there's more structure that is already there. There's an HR department. There's so there's some of that measures. Like you don't muck around as
There's regulation. It's regulation.
Well, yeah, you don't muck around in people's sense of self. Like you just don't do that. But the other thing is there's a shared goal that's being worked on. There's some kind of a shared objective or a shared goal or a shared
Mhm.
outcome that you're aiming the work towards. And then people can take that work that you're aiming towards that shared goal, maybe I worked with a retailer for that, those stores or, that company's reputation or whatever. You can take some of those same tools and automatically people are, of course, also applying it to other areas in their life. When I did trainings with district managers and we were talking about how to be effective with their store managers, and regularly people in the class are commenting like, "Oh, I think that might work with my wife too. Do you think it would?" And I'm like, Probably would, listening. Yes, guys, that'll work really well with your wife. Trust me."
I don't
But we
even, by
weren't.
the way, in my organizational work, I don't even attempt to draw that line. I give people one of my favorite pieces of homework in, say, a 4-day workshop to give overnight is to call, or if they're staying at home, go home and ask your wife, what have you been trying to tell me that I haven't been willing to listen to?
Oh, so you
And
give up using the personal. Yeah, I didn't do that. I let them bring it up,
I
and then
do that because they find out
yeah,
that could, if you ask executives to rate themselves on how good a listener they are, they all put themselves way up
I
there. 10 out of 5. Send them home with that assignment and some coaching on how to do it, and they get a good solid dose of reality. Yeah, it's absolutely, you're absolutely right. I've
it's
done.
so much more I mean, and I've seen business organizations where it gets culty also and causes huge damage. I mean, I've actually
Yep.
talked with a few people that had literally transformational consultants destroy a company from the inside out, mostly because they don't know in my world when I listen to it, it's like that's not even the work of transformation. Like what that person was teaching or coaching or working was not, it's not it. That's not it. It's got some of the words, it's got some of the look, but that's not really what we're talking about, for example. And that's what this show's about, confronting the line. Let's find out what's healthy, safe, and ethical versus what is not. You can't do that without being willing to look at what is not, which has to me been another huge problem is in that industry, in the self-help industry, in the wellness industry, the only people want to talk about is the magic and the miracles, and they're not willing to talk about the risks and the harms. And so my little attempt here is to balance that out a little bit and give us a place where we can talk openly and honestly about both. So I really appreciate your partnership and play in that. And so I'm excited. So we've covered in our book, we called it a master class, which sent some people into hysteria. What it really, what it is a
Hey, I
discussion.
gave up master bedroom. I'm not
That's
giving up
right.
master
You
class.
did. Yes, you did. Well, if you actually look up what masterclass is, I'm like, oh, that's exactly what it is. So we
Well,
are,
there's two meanings of the word. There's mastery, which Dan Pink says is essential. The
yeah,
opportunity for mastery is essential in intrinsic motivation. And then there's master, serf, master slave, master, the hierarchical meaning of the
the
word.
dominator version.
In
Yeah.
master class, whether it's Maria Callas or Pablo Casals or whoever is giving it, it's someone who has mastered a craft or an art or a
Yeah.
subject who's now going to teach it.
Yeah. Which is why I was so excited to host the transformation from potential to practice masterclass and to, co-facilitate that conversation so that we could really explore these ideas. And we've gone through the first 5 chapters, which I am going to make that available to folks. So
And it
shameless
was a
plug.
gas.
It's been I've learned a lot. How about
Me
you? Like,
too.
I mean,
Absolutely.
I've learned a lot because, a group that's been hanging with us, having those conversations have brought so much to the
Yeah,
conversations.
such smart people.
Really smart. And they are true dialogues. It's a true dialogue, discourse, conversation. While you have, definite mastery in this domain, in this area, I have a level of mastery. So does everybody else on the call. It has just been really juicy conversations. And so we're going to make them available to folks. Even if they come in on the second half looking at organizational transformation, they'll have the opportunity to have the recordings and hear those initial conversations, and they're not essential for the next part, which I'm really looking forward to. Does these methodologies really make a difference in shifting the culture in organizations? Because in my adult life, I can't think of a time where it's been more needed and wanted than right now. You want to say particularly about this time, because this time we're at in history, as it were, I think is a time where organizations are particularly flailing and in a lot of ways. And maybe that's always been the case, but it just feels, and there's a lot
It
of
hasn't always been the case. There have been long periods of time when organizations were very stable. We're seeing the death throes of command and control. We're seeing the death throes of transactionalism. If anybody thought that the default paradigm of society was going to go down without a fight, they were very naive. This is the fight. I think we'll win. I do believe, as I have since he said it, as Dr. King said, that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. That's what my life has been about.
Wow. I really hope
That's
you're
who
right.
I am, is I'm creating a world where people are treated fairly and justly. It won't be accomplished in my lifetime. But Ann, the best time, the two best times to plant a tree, 20 years ago was one of them.
Okay.
And the other one's today.
Really? Why so? Why do you say that? Why today?
Because that tree my grandchildren will sit under.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Wow. Well, I really hope you're right. I'm feeling particularly a little resigned right now.
Oh, so am I.
I know many, many people are, and frustrated and scared. That's probably what's underneath all of it, is just fear for the future. Fear. I have 5 grandchildren,
Waist deep in the big muddy.
Yeah. So, but all we can do is what we can do. And we need to be true to ourselves and our values. That's why I wrote the book I wrote, because the work that I loved, I saw as being misused and abused and endangered. I've learned a lot since I wrote that book. I'm about to start working on my next book with everything that I've learned. But I still think there's, wisdom, huge wisdom in there. And if we can pull it out and bring it forward and evolve it, we can help humanity.
Just remember, the work that you loved was not the forum or the wisdom course or the S training. The work that you loved was transformation.
Right. That's right. Yeah, I mean, I love Sarah and Nippy of A Little Bit Cult. They always say this great thing: if there wasn't good stuff in there, nobody would join those groups. So what I'm interested in is the good stuff, and there is good stuff. And I do continue.
And by the way, before we get mail about this, there are groups where there was no good stuff.
That's
and people joined, but not because there was good stuff. I'm thinking about Jim Jones. I'm thinking about Nexium.
Not exactly true. They did, in their experience, there was good stuff.
You can convince anybody of anything. I'm just saying.
Exactly. This is why I'm a huge advocate of, and I'm probably going to do a masterclass I'm going to invite John Atack to do a masterclass with me on his book, Opening Our Minds, which I think should be reading. There's several books actually, but should
excellent, terrific book.
We have to understand how easily we can be manipulated by ourselves and others. I mean, we're our own first main manipulator, and others. And once we start to see that and understand that, it's much easier to sort of defend against it, mostly just to walk away, like, whoa, that's not true, and walk away and look for something else. But anyway, we'll do a whole other show about that.
I was interviewed on a podcast about coaching last week, and the interviewer, guy named, I'm sorry, I blocked out his last name, but he asked 2 questions or asked one question that stumped me. He said, "What's the most outrageous thing you do as a coach?" And I said, "I don't think I do anything outrageous. None of it looks outrageous to me." He said, "Well, we talked about some more." And I said, "Well, and somebody will say something about themselves like, I'm not worth it. And I'll say, is that true?" And he just about fell out of his chair. He said, that's the most outrageous thing I've ever heard. And for me, it's like, yeah, challenge what you think are truths.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. This is another fantastic thing in your book, is you outline what is reality? What are like you have a very simple
Facts
measure.
versus
Well,
interpretations.
yeah, we'll leave that as a teaser. Follow us on the socials. We might make a meme out of it because it's definitely meme worthy in this day and age. Anyway, overall, Ed, thank you so much. I appreciate you, and everybody, thanks for joining. This is what conversations with Ann and Ed sound like. We wander all over the place. We get into all kinds of dicey, deep issues, and all around have a really great time, and hopefully come out a little bit smarter than we were, or maybe less smarter. That's probably a better goal for us, huh?
Yeah, probably.
Less smarter than we were before we
Just
started.
remember that, well, here's the thing. It isn't a question of smart. The smarter you are, the less you know.
That's right. The more questions you have. I was just telling somebody that the older I get, the less I know and the more questions I have. So
Right.
thanks for being a fellow questioner, and we will
And
talk.
thanks to Tony for doing the hard work on this one to make
No
it
kidding.
presentable.
No kidding. And folks, watch in the show notes. We will have a link to the second half of the masterclass. We would invite
Gary Nowak, Nowak. That's who interviewed me.
Aha. Okay, maybe we'll put a link.
Coffee House Coaching is the podcast.
Okay, great. We'll plug in for that too. That's awesome. But anyway, thank you very much, and we will talk soon.